speaking to you about the book of Revelation. And before we really get into a serious examination and study of the book of Revelation, we need a framework for interpretation. And what I'm suggesting as a framework for interpretation of the book of Revelation is just to say, let's just take it at face value and believe that it means what it says and believe that it is what it purports to be. That is to say, a letter written to 7 churches warning them to be faithful and to stand strong. John tells them over and over again, the time is near, the time is at hand, the time is short, words of that kind. If John is writing to those first 7 churches, those 7 churches in Asia, the first recipients of this book of Revelation, if he is writing to them about events that were not going to take place in their lifetime, but rather take place in our lifetime or our future, then he lied to them, because he told them that the time was near. So they would have logically expected the nearness of the events that were symbolized and described in the book of Revelation. Now, I know we have a preconceived idea that it's talking about something in the faraway future or in the near future for us, but if it is, then he lied to his first recipients, because he told them that the time is near. Now, what I'm suggesting is, before we talk about the spiritual application of the book of Revelation to us, and we will talk about that, let's consider the possibility that it really did mean something to the people that John really did send it to. Now, was there any event in that first century to whom John was writing, was there any catastrophic event that would qualify as being worthy of being discussed in the apocalyptic terms that John uses in this book of Revelation? Well, as a matter of fact, there is. It was so significant that Jesus devoted much of his ministry to talking about it. It's so significant that not only did Jesus talk about it in many of his parables and much of his teaching, John the Baptist himself, the forerunner of Jesus, talked about it. The subject is the wrath to come, what was going to come to pass very soon on the nation of Israel. Here's what John the Baptist said in Matthew chapter 3, verse 7. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, he said unto them, O generation of vipers, who has warned you to flee from the wrath to come? And then in verse 10 he said, And now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. He said to the Pharisees, Who warned you? Meaning you. And he said, This generation, you generation of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Not meaning some wrath to come in a faraway future that had nothing to do with them. He singled out them and he said, you. And if you want to know the time frame, he said in verse 10, now. The word now means now. Now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. John was saying there is an imminent judgment coming on you, Pharisees and Sadducees, you generation of vipers who have come to his baptism to mock him and to not believe in him. He said, the axe is now laid to the root of the trees. He was predicting something very soon to come to pass that was imminent, not for our day, but for their day. Jesus used the same subject for many of his parables. In one of his parables, he told about a king who sent out invitations to the marriage of his son. The son is Jesus. The people who first got the invitations were the nation of Israel. They rejected him. They refused to come. The king was angry. And before he went out into the highways and byways, this is in Matthew chapter 22, before he went out into the highways and byways to invite everyone else representing the Gentiles, he said this about those who first refused him, meaning the nation of Israel. But when the king heard thereof, he was wroth. That means very angry. And he sent forth his armies. And he destroyed those murderers. And he burned up their city. Now, I wonder what that's talking about. It's talking about what was going to come to pass in the near future. The judgment upon national Israel. When the armies of Rome marched into Jerusalem and they tore down the temple, they left not one stone upon another. Jesus said he will send forth his armies and destroy those murderers, burn up their city. That is the judgment upon Jerusalem that was soon to come to pass. That's what John was talking about, the wrath to come, for which the axe was even then laid at the root of the trees upon that generation of Pharisees and Sadducees. In another parable, in Matthew 21, Jesus gave a parable of the vineyard and about a man who had a vineyard, and he let it out to husbandmen, and he sent to them prophets and wise men and messengers representing the Old Testament period in which prophets and wise men came to Israel. Then it says, last of all, Jesus said, the Lord sent his own son, saying, they will reverence my son. But instead the husbandmen took the son and they threw him out of the vineyard and they killed him. That represents the fact, and we know that that's what happened to Jesus. And it's speaking, the scribes and Pharisees said that they knew that he was speaking about them. Now here's what Jesus said. This is a very pointed question on which he ends this parable. He said, "When the Lord of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those husbandmen?" And they answer him, "He will miserably destroy those wicked men, and he will let out the vineyard to other husbandmen, which shall render unto him their fruits in their seasons." Again, Jesus is speaking of the judgment that is to come upon the nation of Israel, that apostate group, that apostate generation that, except for a few exceptions, rejected Jesus. He said he will destroy those wicked men and will let their vineyard out to other ones. Here's another one. Jesus, another prediction of doom and judgment upon national Israel. Matthew chapter 23, verse 34. After pronouncing woe upon the scribes and Pharisees, he says, "Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them you shall kill and crucify, some of them you shall scourge in your synagogues, you shall persecute them from city to city, that upon you," meaning those people he was speaking to, "that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation." Now, let's just make a couple of observations about what we've just read. Number one, the first point is, God had dealt patiently with the nation of Israel over several years throughout the Old Testament period, but his efforts were for the most part met with persistent resistance and rebellion. Number two, the time of God's dealings with national Israel was drawing to a close, and in a very short period of time he would sever his covenant connection with them and establish a new covenant with others, primarily that is the Gentiles. Number three, a catastrophic event would very shortly take place in which the Lord himself would come to the vineyard and destroy the wicked and their city. We just read that in those parables. Number four, this event would take place within a span of the generation then living. Jesus said that over and over and over again. This generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. In Matthew 23:36, he said, "All these things shall come upon this generation." There is no other way to understand that. There is no other way to read that. The fullest description of this judgment on Jerusalem is found in a passage that all three of the synoptic gospel writers record, but not John. It's called the Olivet Discourse. Matthew records it, Mark records it, Luke records it, but John does not record it. The interesting thing is, some have suggested, and I think it's true, that John's Revelation is a whole book devoted to that, what's the content of what's in that Olivet Discourse. Let me put up on the screen for you a chart. This is prepared by a man named David Chilton in his book Days of Vengeance. I thought it was so good I want to reproduce it for you. It shows you the parallels between the Olivet Discourse as presented in the three synoptic Gospels and in Revelation chapter 6. That's the beginning of the opening of the seals, representing judgment on Jerusalem. First of all, in Matthew 24, in verse 6, wars. In verse 7, international strife, famines, earthquakes. Verses 9 through 13, persecutions. And finally, 15 through 31 describe decreation or destruction. In Mark 13, which records the Olivet Discourse in Mark's Gospel, verse 7, wars. Verse 8, international strife, earthquakes, famines, persecutions, verses 9 through 13, decreation, verses 14 through 27. In Luke 21, wars in verse 9, international strife in verse 10, verse 11, earthquakes and plagues and famines, persecution, verses 12 through 19, and decreation, verses 20 through 27. Now let's come to Revelation chapter 6 and compare that to the Olivet Discourse. This is the beginning of the opening of the seals. In Revelation 6, verses 1 through 2, war. Verses 3 through 4, international strife. Verses 5 through 6, famine. Verses 7 through 8, pestilence. Verses 9 through 11, persecution. Verses 12 through 17, earthquake and decreation. These are unmistakable and obvious links between the Gospels and the book of Revelation, especially in chapter 6. Here, let me just give you a couple more before we run out of time. When Jesus was being led to be crucified, he said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me." This is in Luke 23:28. "But for yourselves. Behold, the days are coming when they shall say, Blessed are the barren," etc., and so on. Verse 30. "Then they shall begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us." Now, if you've read the book of Revelation, you've heard that language before. It's found in Revelation chapter 6, verse 15. The kings of the earth, and so on and so forth. Verse 16, it says, "They said to the rocks and to the mountains, Fall on us. Hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come. Who shall be able to stand?" I wonder where that language comes from. It came from Jesus in Luke's Gospel, describing the judgment upon Jerusalem.